You won't believe what happened when a billionaire discovered a black maid sleeping on the floor with her baby. The clock struck midnight in the marble halls of one of Manhattan's most exclusive penthouses, but in the nursery, sleep was a distant dream. A baby's cries pierced the silence, echoing off walls adorned with paintings worth more than most people's homes. But it wasn't the billionaire father who rushed to comfort the child. It wasn't the mother, sleeping soundly in her silk sheets 3 rooms away. Instead, a figure emerged in the shadows, a woman whose callous hands told stories of hardship, whose tired eyes held depths of love that money could never buy. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to exist without taking up space, reaching into the golden crib with the tenderness of a mother. The baby's cries softened at her touch, tiny fingers grasping for the comfort only she seemed to provide. As the infant finally settled, the woman didn't retreat to some comfortable bed. Instead, she lowered herself onto the cold marble floor, positioning herself like a guardian between the crib and the world beyond. Her name was Maria, and tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, she would sleep on stone so that this child would never feel alone. What the mansion's other residents didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that this woman's sacrifice ran deeper than anyone suspected. But before we reveal the truth that would shake this house of wealth to its very foundation, we need to understand how she came to be here, sleeping on floors in a palace where others walked on clouds. 6 months earlier, Maria had arrived at the Whitmore estate with nothing but a worn suitcase and a letter of recommendation from an agency downtown. The other staff members watched her with barely concealed disdain as she was led to the grand foyer, their eyes taking inventory of her second-hand clothes and nervous demeanor. To them, she was just another desperate woman willing to work for scraps in their world of excess. "Another one from the charity cases," whispered Helena, the head housekeeper, to the cook as they watched Maria being shown to the servants' quarters. "She'll be gone within a month. They always are." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting through the air like broken glass. But Maria endured. She endured the dismissive glances when she asked questions about her duties. She endured being served smaller portions at staff meals, while others complained about the abundance. She endured being assigned the hardest tasks, scrubbing floors until her knees bled, washing windows in the bitter cold, working 16-hour days without complaint. They tested her limits daily, expecting her to break, to quit, to prove their assumptions right. "She thinks she's better than us," muttered James, the butler, watching Maria work through her lunch break. "Mark my words, she's after something. They always are." Yet Maria remained silent, her dignity intact despite their cruelty. She had survived worse than their petty humiliations, had endured losses that would have broken weaker souls. Their whispers and cold shoulders were nothing compared to the storms she had already weathered. What they saw as weakness was actually in strength forged in fires they couldn't imagine. Everything changed the day Mrs. Whitmore announced she needed someone to help with the baby. The other staff members exchanged knowing looks. Caring for the billionaire's heir was a position of trust, something surely reserved for someone with proper credentials, proper breeding. They watched with barely contained shock as Maria was selected, as if luck had somehow favored the undeserving. Her? With the baby? Helena's voice dripped with disbelief. She doesn't even have children of her own. What could she possibly know about caring for Whitmore? If they had bothered to listen, really listen, they might have heard the pain that flashed across Maria's face at those words. If they had looked beyond their prejudices, they might have seen the way her hands trembled slightly when she first held little Alexander, the way her eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. But they were too busy judging to see the woman beneath their assumptions. The humiliation intensified once Maria began caring for Alexander. Every small mishap became her fault. Every moment of the baby's discomfort blamed on her inadequacy. When Alexander cried during a dinner party, Maria was summoned and scolded in front of guests. When he developed a minor rash, she was accused of negligence. When he refused to eat, they questioned her competence. "She's too attached," Mrs. Whitmore confided to her friends over afternoon tea, glancing toward the nursery where Maria's soft lullabies could be heard. "It's unsettling, the way she looks at him, holds him, like he's her own child." The other staff fed these suspicions with poisonous whispers. They spoke of how Maria lingered in the nursery long after her shifts ended, how she hummed unfamiliar songs that seemed to calm the baby instantly, how she knew exactly what he needed before he even cried. To them, her intuitive care was suspicious rather than remarkable, her devotion threatening rather than admirable. "She's planning something," they murmured among themselves. "No one works that hard without an agenda. She probably thinks she can worm her way into the family's good graces, maybe even get something in the will." But their cruelest weapon was their ignorance of her past. They mocked her accent, her clothes, her humble demeanor, never knowing that every slight cut deeper because of what she carried in her heart. They saw poverty as a character flaw, humility as weakness, not understanding that both had been carved into her soul by circumstances beyond her control. The breaking point came on a particularly difficult evening when Mrs. Whitmore returned from a charity gala to find Alexander fussing. Without investigating the cause, a diaper pin that had come loose and was poking the baby. She immediately summoned Maria to the grand staircase where the other staff could witness her humiliation. "This is unacceptable," Mrs. Whitmore's voice echoed through the marble halls. "My son should never be in distress. What exactly am I paying you for?" Maria stood silent, head bowed, as the accusations rained down. She could have explained about the pin, could have defended herself, but she had learned long ago that the powerful rarely listen to the powerless. Instead, she absorbed their words like stones, each one adding weight to burdens she already carried. Yet even as she was being dressed down, even as the other staff watched with satisfied smirks, Maria's only concern remained a baby in her arms. She gently adjusted his position, whispered soothing words that only he could hear, her love unchanged by their hatred. This moment of tenderness, witnessed by all but understood by none, would later prove more significant than anyone could imagine. Night after night, as the mansion settled into wealthy slumber, Maria maintained her vigil on the nursery floor. She had positioned herself as a barrier between Alexander and any harm that might threaten him, her body a shield, her presence a constant comfort. The cold marble numbed her bones, but she endured it gladly, knowing that above her, a child slept peacefully because she was there. What she didn't know was that someone had begun to notice her sacrifice. Mr. Whitmore, working late in his study, had started hearing her gentle lullabies drifting through the ventilation system. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, filled with a sadness that spoke of deep loss and deeper love. Night after night, those songs drew him from his paperwork, though he couldn't explain why. The household staff continued their campaign of subtle cruelty, but cracks were beginning to show in their unified front. The cook noticed how Maria never complained when given the smallest portions, instead often giving half of her meager meal to the stray cat that visited the kitchen. The gardener saw how she tended to wilted flowers in her spare time, bringing them back to life with the same gentle care she showed the baby. Even Helena, despite her harsh words, found herself impressed by Maria's unbreakable spirit. But it was the baby himself who served as the most compelling witness to Maria's character. Alexander, who had been colicky and difficult for his parents and previous caregivers, was transformed in Maria's presence. He smiled more, cried less, and seemed to thrive under her attentive care. Visitors commented on how content the child appeared, how peaceful the nursery felt. Never knowing that this transformation was born from the love of a woman they barely acknowledged. The tension in the household reached a crescendo when Mrs. Whitmore's mother visited and witnessed Maria's interaction with Alexander. The elderly woman, sharp-eyed and perceptive, watched as Maria anticipated the baby's needs with uncanny accuracy, as she soothed him with techniques that spoke of deep experience and intuition. "That woman," she told her daughter privately, "loves that child as if he were her own flesh and blood. The question is, why?" Mrs. Whitmore brushed off her mother's observations, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. She began watching Maria more closely, noting the way the maid's face lit up when Alexander laughed, the way she spoke to him as if he could understand every word, the way she protected him from even the smallest discomforts with fierce determination. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore found himself increasingly drawn to those midnight lullabies. Something about them stirred memories he couldn't quite place, emotions he thought he had buried beneath years of corporate ruthlessness. One particularly restless night, when insomnia had claimed him completely, he decided to investigate the source of those haunting melodies. He moved through the darkened halls like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the marble floors. The closer he got to the nursery, the clearer the lullaby became, and with it, something else, the sound of quiet weeping woven between the verses. Someone was singing through tears, their voice breaking with a pain so profound it made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. Standing in the doorway of the nursery, illuminated only by the soft glow of a nightlight, Mr. Whitmore witnessed something that would change everything. There was Maria, curled on the cold floor like a faithful dog, one arm stretched toward the crib in a gesture of protection that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. She was singing in a language he didn't recognize, her voice carrying notes of loss and love in equal measure. But it was what happened next that shattered his assumptions completely. Alexander, still fast asleep, suddenly stirred and whimpered. Without opening her eyes, without fully waking, Maria's hand moved instinctively to rock the crib gently, her lullaby shifting to a more soothing tone. The baby settled immediately, as if her presence alone was enough to keep his nightmares at bay. In that moment, Mr. Whitmore saw what everyone else had missed. This wasn't the devotion of an employee seeking favor or advancement. This was the love of a mother, pure, selfless, and absolute. The realization hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to grab the doorframe for support. Who was this woman who slept on stone so his son could sleep on silk? What had driven her to such devotion? Unable to sleep after what he had witnessed, Mr. Whitmore retreated to his study and did something he had never done before. He investigated one of his employees. What he discovered in Maria's background check made his blood run cold with shame. The woman sleeping on his nursery floor had once been Maria Santos, a young mother who had lost her own 3-year-old son to pneumonia because she couldn't afford proper medical care. The reports painted a picture of devastating loss and incredible resilience. Maria had worked 3 jobs trying to pay for her son's treatment, had sold everything she owned, had begged on street corners for money that might save his life. But it hadn't been enough. Her son, Diego, had died in a public hospital, alone because she had been working a night shift, tried to earn the money for medicine that would arrive too late. The tragedy had broken her completely. She had lost her apartment, her jobs, everything that had anchored her to her previous life. For months, she had wandered the streets, unable to bear the thought of being around children, unable to function in a world where her baby no longer existed. It was only through a church charity program that she had slowly begun to rebuild, taking on domestic work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. But here in his home, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a nursery, she found something that called to the maternal instinct that losing Diego had never killed. She wasn't caring for Alexander as an employee. She was loving him as the mother she would always be, honoring the memory of the son she had lost by ensuring no child in her care would ever feel abandoned. The morning brought new understanding to the Whitmore household. Though not everyone was ready for the truth, Mr. Whitmore watched the morning routine with different eyes, seeing how Maria moved through her duties with the exhaustion of someone who had spent another night on a marble floor. He saw how the other staff continued their small cruelties, unaware that their target possessed a strength born from surviving the unsurvivable. When Helena made another cutting remark about Maria's presumptuous behavior with the baby, Mr. Whitmore felt something snap inside him. For too long, he had allowed his household to run on assumptions and prejudices, had been too absent to see the treasure hiding in plain sight. The woman they mocked and dismissed had given his son something money couldn't buy, the security of unconditional love. But before he could act on his newfound knowledge, fate intervened in the form of Mrs. Whitmore's growing suspicions. She had noticed her husband's changed behavior, his sudden interest in household affairs, his questions about the staff. When she discovered that he had been investigating Maria's background, her paranoia reached dangerous levels. "She's manipulated you somehow," Mrs. Whitmore declared during a heated argument in their bedroom. "First the baby, now you. She's probably planning to sue us, claim some inappropriate relationship, destroy our reputation." The accusation was so far from the truth that Mr. Whitmore almost laughed, but he could see that his wife's fears were genuine, rooted in a worldview that couldn't comprehend love without ulterior motive. The confrontation that followed would test not only Maria's strength, but the entire household's capacity for redemption. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Are you in a place where you've witnessed injustice, where you've seen the powerful overlook the powerless? Hold that feeling, because what happened next in the Whitmore mansion would challenge everything they thought they knew about worth, dignity, and the true meaning of service. The confrontation came at the worst possible moment. Alexander had been fussy all day, running a slight fever that had the household on edge. Maria had barely left his side, using every trick she had learned from caring for Diego to keep the baby comfortable. She had foregone meals, ignored her exhaustion, and poured every ounce of her energy into ensuring Alexander's well-being. It was in this state, disheveled from hours of devoted care, swaying on her feet from fatigue, that Mrs. Whitmore chose to strike. She burst into the nursery, followed by Helena and several other staff members, her face flushed with anger and suspicion. "Enough," she declared, her voice sharp enough to startle Alexander into crying. "I know what you're doing, and it ends now. Your manipulation, your scheming. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Maria, cradling the distressed baby, looked up with confusion that was heartbreakingly genuine. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Alexander has been sick. I was only what? Only trying to turn my husband against me? Only attempting to position yourself as indispensable so you can make demands later?" Mrs. Whitmore's accusations grew more wild with each word, fueled by insecurities that had nothing to do with Maria's actual behavior. The other staff members watched with barely concealed glee as their tormentor finally faced her comeuppance. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The exposure of her supposed schemes, the validation of their suspicions. They expected her to break down, to confess, to reveal the calculating nature they were certain lay beneath her humble exterior. Instead, Maria did something that stunned them all. She gently placed Alexander in his crib, ensuring he was secure and comfortable despite his continued cries. Then she turned to face her accusers with a dignity that made several of them shift uncomfortably. "I have no schemes, Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. "I care for your son because he is a child who needs care. Nothing more, nothing less." "Liar." Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked completely. "No one works as hard as you do without expecting something in return. No one sacrifices their own comfort for a stranger's child. It's not natural." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Maria held sacred. In that moment, she could have told them about Diego, could have explained the grief that drove her devotion, could have made them understand the love that made her sacrifice seem natural rather than suspicious. But she had learned long ago that pain shared with the unsympathetic only became a weapon in their hands. "Some things cannot be bought or sold," Maria replied simply. "Love is one of them." It was then that Mr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion and his son's distressed cries. What he saw was a tableau that revealed the true character of everyone involved. His wife, red-faced with anger based on assumptions. The staff, eagerly watching for Maria's downfall, and Maria herself, standing with quiet dignity while his son cried behind her, her only concern the child's distress rather than her own defense. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, causing everyone to freeze. Mrs. Whitmore launched into her accusations, painting Maria as a manipulative schemer who had somehow bewitched both husband and child. The staff nodded along, adding their own observations about Maria's suspicious behavior, her unnatural devotion, her presumptuous attachment to the baby. Throughout it all, Maria remained silent, her only movement being the gentle swaying motion she made whenever Alexander's cries became particularly distressed. Even while being attacked, even while her character was being assassinated, her instinct was to comfort the child. Mr. Whitmore listened to every word, his expression growing darker with each accusation. When the litany of complaints finally ended, the room fell into expectant silence. Everyone waited for his judgment, certain that Maria's time in their household was over. "Maria," he said finally, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone straighten, "is it true that you sleep on the nursery floor?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, causing Mrs. Whitmore to frown in confusion. Maria met his gaze directly, her chin lifting slightly. "Yes, sir." "Every night?" "Yes, sir." "And why do you do this?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Maria's composure wavered slightly. She glanced at Alexander, whose cries had quieted at the sound of familiar voices, then back at Mr. Whitmore. "Because children should never sleep alone if they don't have to," she said simply. "Because someone should always be there to chase away the nightmares." The simplicity of her answer, the matter-of-fact way she described her sacrifice, hit the room like a thunderbolt. Here was a woman who had endured months of humiliation, who was currently facing accusations that could destroy her livelihood, and her primary concern remained the well-being of a child who wasn't even hers. Mr. Whitmore walked to the crib and looked down at his son, who had finally stopped crying and was looking up with wide, curious eyes. When Alexander saw his father, he didn't reach up with the desperate need of a child seeking comfort. Instead, he glanced toward Maria with the secure confidence of a child who knew his protector was near. "Do you know," Mr. Whitmore said to the room, though his eyes remained on his son, "what I discovered when I researched Maria's background?" Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about the direction of the conversation. The staff exchanged nervous glances, sensing that the wind was changing in ways they hadn't expected. "I learned," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "that Maria Santos once had a son named Diego. He died of pneumonia at the age of 3 because she couldn't afford proper medical care, despite working 3 jobs and selling everything she owned trying to save him." The silence that followed was deafening. Several staff members looked stricken, finally understanding the depth of pain they had been mocking. Mrs. Whitmore's face went pale as the implications of her accusations became clear. "She lost her child," Mr. Whitmore said, each word deliberate and weighted, "and instead of letting that loss make her bitter, she chose to pour all that love into caring for ours. She sleeps on the floor not because she's scheming, but because she knows what it means for a child to be alone in the dark. She works without complaint not because she's plotting, but because she understands how precious and fragile life can be." He turned to face the assembled group, his expression terrible in its controlled fury. "And you, all of you, saw this devotion and decided it was suspicious. You saw love and called it manipulation. You saw sacrifice and called it scheming." Maria stood perfectly still, tears streaming down her face as her secret pain was laid bare for all to see. But these weren't tears of shame or humiliation. They were tears of relief. Finally, someone understood. Finally, someone saw her not as a threat to be neutralized, but as a mother whose love had survived even the death of her child. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to crack under the weight of realization. I didn't know. She never said. She never said because she has more dignity in her little finger than the rest of us have in our entire bodies," Mr. Whitmore replied harshly. "She never explained because she's learned that people like us don't listen to explanations from people like her." Helena, who had led so many of the whispered campaigns against Maria, found herself unable to meet anyone's eyes. The cook, who had rationed Maria's portions while allowing others to waste food, felt sick with shame. One by one, the staff members who had participated in Maria's humiliation were forced to confront the ugliness of their assumptions. But Mr. Whitmore wasn't finished. He walked to where Maria stood and, to everyone's shock, extended his hand to her, not as employer to employee, but as one human being to another. "Maria Santos," he said formally, "I apologize on behalf of my family and household for the treatment you have endured. Your devotion to my son has been a gift we didn't deserve and certainly didn't appreciate." Maria looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she slowly reached out and shook his hand, the gesture simple yet profound in its implications. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. "No," he replied firmly. "Thank you. Thank you for loving my son when we were too blind to see how much love he was receiving. Thank you for sacrificing your comfort for his well-being. Thank you for being the mother he needed when his own parents were too caught up in their own concerns to notice." The transformation that followed was swift and dramatic. Word of the confrontation spread through social circles with the speed of wildfire, but the narrative was not what the staff had expected. Instead of being vindicated, they found themselves cast as the villains in a story of love triumphing over prejudice. Mrs. Whitmore's friends, who had once whispered about Maria's inappropriate attachment to the baby, now spoke in hushed tones about their own shame in not recognizing true devotion when they saw it. The immediate changes in the household were striking. Maria was moved from the servants' quarters to a comfortable room adjacent to the nursery, close enough to respond to Alexander's needs, but far enough to have her own private space. Her meals were no longer meager portions eaten in the kitchen, but proper, nutritious food served with the respect due to someone whose work was finally valued. More importantly, the other staff members began to see Maria with new eyes. Helena, crushed by the weight of her own cruelty, approached Maria with a stammering apology that took enormous courage to deliver. The cook, who had once sneered at Maria's simple table manners, now sought her advice on preparing foods that would help Alexander through his occasional fussy periods. The gardener, who had previously ignored her, began leaving small bouquets of flowers in her room, a silent acknowledgment of the beauty she had brought to their harsh household. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander himself. No longer forced to choose between parents who saw him as a responsibility and a caregiver who saw him as a joy, he flourished in ways that amazed everyone. His laughter became a constant soundtrack to the nursery. His development accelerated beyond normal milestones, and his attachment to Maria deepened into something that resembled a bond between mother and child. Mrs. Whitmore, forced to confront her own insecurities and prejudices, began to see her son's relationship with Maria not as a threat, but as a blessing. Watching Alexander's face light up when Maria entered her room, seeing how naturally he turned to her for comfort, she began to understand that love was not a finite resource to be guarded jealously, but an infinite gift that grew stronger when shared. The ripple effects extended beyond the household walls. Mr. Whitmore, shaken by his own blindness to Maria's worth, began to examine his business practices with new eyes. How many employees had he overlooked or undervalued? How many people of genuine worth had he dismissed because they didn't fit his preconceived notions of success? The changes he made to his companies, better benefits, more opportunities for advancement, programs to support employees facing personal hardships, became part of his legacy, all inspired by a maid who had taught him that true value couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Maria, for her part, never spoke of her vindication as a victory. When reporters tried to interview her about the story that had captivated the city's attention, she declined with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout her ordeal. Her focus remained on Alexander, on giving him the kind of childhood she had been unable to provide for Diego, on honoring her lost son's memory through her devotion to this living child. The nursery, once a place of secret sacrifice, became the heart of a transformed household. Visitors often comment on the atmosphere of peace and love that permeated the room, never knowing that it had been built on a foundation of grief transformed into purpose. Maria's lullabies, no longer sung through tears of sorrow, carried notes of joy that spoke to the healing power of love given freely and without expectation of return. As Alexander grew from infant to toddler, his bond with Maria remained unshakable. She was his first word, not mama or dada, but Maya, his baby pronunciation of her name. She was the one he ran to when he fell, the one who dried his tears and celebrated his triumphs. In every way that mattered, she was his mother, chosen not by blood but by the depth of her commitment to his well-being. The story of Maria's transformation from despised servant to beloved family member became a legend in their social circle, told and retold as an example of how love could triumph over prejudice, how worth could be recognized even when it came in unexpected packages. But for Maria herself, the greatest victory was much simpler. Alexander would grow up knowing he was cherished, protected, and valued. He would never experience the abandonment and loss that had shaped her own life. On quiet evenings, when Alexander had fallen asleep in his own bed, a real bed, not a crib that required a guardian on the floor, Maria would sometimes sit by his window and think of Diego. She would tell him about his little brother, about the privileged child who had given her a reason to keep living when grief threatened to consume her. In caring for Alexander, she had found a way to parent again, to channel her maternal love into something beautiful and life-giving. The room that had once witnessed her humiliation now stood as a testament to the transformative power of recognized worth. No longer did Maria sleep on cold marble. No longer did she hide her love behind a mask of servitude. She had been seen, truly seen, and in that seeing, everyone around her had been forced to confront their own capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Where are you in your own story of recognition? Are you the one sleeping on floors, giving your all while others question your motives? Or are you among those who need to open their eyes to the treasures hiding in plain sight? The truth is, we all have the power to be either the blind household staff or the awakened father who finally saw what had been there all along. The legacy of that midnight revelation extends far beyond one household, far beyond one relationship between a grieving mother and a cherished child. It reminds us that dignity cannot be bought, that love is the greatest act of service, and that sometimes the quietest sacrifices hold the most transformative power. Maria Santos taught a household of privilege that worth isn't measured in bank accounts or pedigrees, but in the willingness to love without expectation, to serve without recognition, and to sacrifice without complaint. Her story challenges us to look beyond our assumptions, to see the humanity in those we might otherwise overlook, and to recognize that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the most humble packages. In the end, the woman who once slept on floors became the foundation upon which a family built their understanding of what it truly means to love. Her quiet strength didn't just change one child's life. It transformed everyone who witnessed the power of love to triumph over prejudice, of worth to shine through even the darkest attempts to diminish it. The nursery may be empty now, its occupant grown and thriving, but the lessons learned within those walls continue to echo through time. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with the simple act of loving completely, even when that love goes unrecognized and unrewarded. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to look more carefully at the people in your own life who give more than they receive, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a time when you witnessed unrecognized worth, or when someone saw value in you that others had missed. And remember, in a world quick to judge and slow to understand, we all have the power to be the one who finally, truly sees. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. The moment when blindness gives way to sight, when assumptions crumble before truth, and when love, patient, enduring, unconditional love, finally receives the recognition it deserved all along.